Well, breaking the silos around finance and the way that we look at infrastructure is the focus not just of what Chris had to share, but now what McCarthy is going to share. Mac came to the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy in Cambridge, Mass. When he took the role of president and CEO of that organization. He came out of the Ford Foundation's metropolitan programs. And he brought with him a global expertise on how you address as a philanthropy the problems. And now with a research organization, with the convening power of the Lincoln Institute, he's really attempting to try to push this discussion forward. We have the report that Chris mentioned, which really helps, I think, clarify the build and design scenario that he described. We also have a report from Mac's organization, both of them on the side there facing the window. So I encourage you after this session with Mac, take a look at those reports before you leave today. Mac, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Gordon.
There's you.
Yeah, thanks. So I'd like to offer you what might seem to be a radical proposition, and I say this with due respect that there are a lot of things that define the quality of life, but I would say there's probably nothing more important to define the quality of life than the character and the quantity of infrastructure that people have at their disposal. And you know, we've just talked about infrastructure. The last speaker talked about infrastructure, and I'm well aware that usually when we talk about infrastructure, people glaze over because it's typically invisible. And that's why I wanted to start with the idea that it's actually the most critical thing for supporting the quality of life. Public health infrastructure, if you didn't have public health infrastructure, what do you think would happen to life expectancy? Cholera is just not a good thing to have with, if you don't have sewers, you're going to have cholera. Comfort alone from the utilities that we have provided and piped directly into our houses. The ease of movement with roads and bridges and public transportation, or the other kind of infrastructure, parks and universities and other things that give us the ability to kind of advance our lives. So you're all urbanists here, and so I just want to ask you, how many people do you think we're going to be adding to the populations of cities over the next 30 years? You must all be able to cite this right from memory. It happens, you read it all the time. Any clue? Let's see, we have 3 billion people in cities now, 6 or so billion people on the planet. How many people are we going to add in the next 30 years to cities? Any guesses? How many? About 2.5 billion people to the cities. And if we do it true to form, of those 2.5 billion people, probably 1 billion people are going to be living in what we call unplanned settlements. The favelas that Leticia was talking about in Brazil. Shanty towns in Africa, or slums. And one of the things that characterizes those slums is that they have no infrastructure. But the other thing about these slums is that we've gotten so used to them, we've started to name them and we know where they are. Like Dharavi in India, or Kibera in Nairobi, or Rocinha, the largest favela in Rio de Janeiro, which has over 300,000 people living in it. Or Kailishia outside of Cape Town. And they've become so common, they've been around so long that we're just used to seeing them. But my question is, with those growing favelas, as Leticia pointed out, in Rio de Janeiro, the favelas grew at 27%, while the city itself only grew at 7%. What are we going to do? How are we going to afford to find ways to not just house the 1 billion people or the 2.5 billion people we're going to bring to the cities, but to provide them with the character and the quality of infrastructure that's going to support a high quality of life? I'm talking about simple stuff: water, wastewater, electricity. All right, but forget about that, because there's lots of reasons why we should care about them. But we've lived for a long time with 850 million people in slums, and we're doing okay. Why should we care about adding another billion people to the cities of the world living in informal settlements around the outside? I'd say there's at least 3 or 4 selfish reasons we should care about it. One is that whatever happens there, we might be exposed to it. Ebola, any other kind of cholera. It doesn't get contained just in the places that happen to be girdling our global cities. By just contact alone, we could actually be exposed. And that's a bad thing. But commerce can be harmed. We'll have harder times moving around. other things can be harmed as well. Just the character of the city, the character of the quality of life for people like us who have never probably lived in a favela or a slum. Or maybe there's a moral reason we should care about it, because we just cannot countenance the idea that 20, 30, 40, sometimes 50% of the people in a world city live with no basic infrastructure. But then again, how much do we care about infrastructure when we can't even maintain our own quality of life? And as you just heard, in the United States, we're $3.6 trillion behind the 8 ball in terms of being able to maintain our own infrastructure, so interstate highways fall into the Mississippi River. So this is a big challenge, right? This is a big challenge in the US, it's a bigger challenge in the globe, because the estimates for the rest of the world are that we're going to need to raise $40 trillion to kind of fund the infrastructure, the basic infrastructure that we're going to need to support the quality of life just over the next 20 years. $40 trillion. Does anybody here know what the GDP of the planet is? Any guesses what the GDP of the planet is? $60 trillion. 60, $65 trillion. So that's only about a quarter of the GDP of the planet. We're going to have to find a way to invest in infrastructure. It's a big challenge, but luckily I'm here to tell you that there is a way we can do it. So I wanted to depress you early so I could leave you feeling good. And what I'm going to talk to you about is how we can actually mobilize land value as a way to provide a new tool to finance infrastructure. And it's actually not that new. We call this innovations in financing, but it's actually been around since the Romans. And this is a picture of Agua Empeada in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And that bridge and the development behind it was made possible by a new instrument for extracting land value called a CPAC. And that's an acronym, a Brazilian or a Portuguese acronym that roughly translates to a certificate for additional development capacity. It's a tradable certificate, and what they do is they use it to actually extract the future value of land that's been developed after it's been improved to pay for the improvements. And one of the things we're finding more and more is that the actual cost of improving land is less than the value of the land after the improvements are made. So the additional value that you add to the land is actually higher than the cost of the improvements. And that shouldn't surprise anybody, because when you add the infrastructure, you make it possible to do denser development, you actually do add a lot of value to land. So in this case, they built that bridge, they were able to build the infrastructure underneath it, and they built the community behind it as a result of being able to marshal the future value of the land and to pass it forward to be able to pay for the infrastructure. So how does it work? How does a CPAC work? Well, a CPAC is just one of a number of value capture instruments that we've been using and testing and implementing in Latin America. And the report that Gordon mentioned that is out on the back table addresses that and others. But a CPAC is a very interesting tool because it actually is it's a tradable certificate that is traded on public markets like a stock exchange. And it's based on kind of a new approach to managing land use by setting a basic floor area ratio, which defines the density at which you can develop land in a city, and then requiring people who want to build denser above that floor area ratio to buy the rights with a publicly traded permit. And that's what a CPAC is. And so the basic FAR that they set for the city of Sao Paulo is 1, meaning that if you own, whatever, a hectare of land, that you can build 100,000 or 10,000 square meters of property on top of it. If you want to build more, you have to buy the right to do that. It's kind of a radical instrument because a lot of people think, well, geez, if I own land, well, why should someone have the right to either limit my ability to build up, or why should they have the right to sell it to somebody else? And in fact, there were lots of constitutional challenges lodged against trying to use value capture tools like this to do this. But in fact, they survived the constitutional challenges because, as it turns out, the rights you acquire when you buy property are actually defined by the state, by the city, by zoning, by building codes. You can't do whatever you want when you buy a piece of property. And the fact that those rights aren't acquired when you acquire the property means that somebody else owns them and conveys them to you. And so as it turns out, in Brazil, in Colombia, in Peru, in Uruguay, in Argentina, they're able to establish that it is legal for the state to take back the added value of land for the public investment that's made. So this is Faria Lima in Sao Paulo, and Faria Lima was developed using CPACs. And the CPACs that they sold to develop Faria Lima were so valuable that they absolutely exceeded the amount that the city officials expected to get. And they were more than they needed to build the underground infrastructure, so they had enough left over to build public parks and social housing. That's very interesting. And in fact, so Faria Lima it's a financial center, it's a mixed-use commercial residential district, and it's a very, very great example. But in 3 other cities in Brazil alone, with Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Curitiba, they've now been able to raise $8 billion just in the sale of CPACs. And there's many other ways that we've been able to use land value to be able to pay for infrastructure. This is something else, some of the infrastructure they're able to build at Faria Lima, an extension of their subway line. This is in Argentina, in Rosario, Argentina. This is a development that was financed using a different value capture mechanism called the betterment contribution to put the streets in, to put the underground infrastructure in, and make the rest of it possible. And this is Faria Lima again. And I think that it's useful to think about just looking at kind of Faria Lima, kind of this idea that we can extract some incremental value of land, to think about what is the philosophy behind this? Why is it that we should be able to extract this incremental value in order to pay for the improvements? And it's based on a simple proposition that was put forward by one of the guys who was responsible for the Lincoln Institute being in existence in the first place, Henry George, who said, the owners of land find ways to make incredible windfalls for nothing they do themselves in terms of the investment in the land. But population pressures, new technologies, all the different things that happen after you buy the land happen to make the land appreciate in value. But why does an idle landowner deserve that value if that value was created by something else? By population pressure, by public investment, by other things? So there's at least a possibility, there's an argument that says whoever actually creates the incremental value of land should at least get a portion of it back. And because public investment in infrastructure is one of the main ways that happens, we find ways to extract that. And we've done it in multiple countries in Latin America using about 10 tools that are in that report that I'll tell you about. But just to tell you that this isn't new. This is a bridge. It's called the Bridge of Commons that was built in Bogota, Colombia in 1809 using a value capture tool called the betterment contribution. The Romans used a value capture to fund roads and aqueducts. So it's been around a long time. It's not purely an innovation, and this, by the way, is Henry George. But now we're exporting it. We're trying to bring it from Latin America to other places. This is Perth, Australia, where they're now trying to find ways to use value capture to fund their light rail. And this is Boston, Massachusetts, where they're now talking about ways to actually meet an unmet obligation to extend one of their subway lines into Somerville. And they're trying to find new ways, including value capture, as a way to finance that. So value capture is a relatively new tool to be used at scale. Today, there's not a single large-scale urban development project in Latin America that is undertaken where the public sector doesn't consider using some method of value capture to finance it. We've now been able to marshal billions and billions of dollars to pay for infrastructure, including the infrastructure that's used to provide basic services to favelas and slums using value capture techniques. And we're just on the cusp of the use of these. There's lots of interest in it, and we've used it very, very little in the United States, but we've used it in many other places in the world. So I urge you to take a look at the report. I urge you to think about at least one creative way that we're going to be able to meet a $40 trillion obligation to really build and fund the infrastructure we're going to need to live a basically good quality of life in the next 50 years, and to really welcome the next 2.5 billion people to the cities that we all love. So thank you very much, and I hope you read the report.